Wyoming Territory, March of 1879, the wind screamed over the hills outside of Sweetwater, and Sheriff Zane Alder rode hard through the sagebrush, tracking the trail of blood and boot prints that led west into the Red Claw Range. He had been following the Mercer gang for 3 days. They had hit the bank in Sweetwater, shot a deputy, and taken a woman. No one knew her name, just that she had been passing through on a stage that never made it to Rock Springs. Folks said she had eyes like thunderclouds and a voice like a songbird, not that anyone had heard it since she vanished. Zane leaned low over his saddle, eyes sharp, jaw set. He was 32, broad-shouldered and quiet-spoken, with a look that made most men think twice before crossing him. He had buried too many friends to tolerate outlaws, and whoever this woman was, he would bring her back. The tracks ended near a box canyon, hidden behind a stand of pine and rock. Zane dismounted, tied his horse behind a thick juniper and moved forward on foot. He stepped quiet, rifle ready, heart drumming hard in his chest. He found the camp just before dusk. 4 men sat around a fire. Their horses were hobbled nearby, rifles leaned against packs. One of them paced near the far end of the camp, where a makeshift shelter of canvas and rope had been thrown up against the canyon wall. Zane's eyes narrowed. That was where they kept her. He waited until dark, then he moved. It was fast, sharp, 3 shots, clean and quiet. One man tried to run, but Zane dropped him before he reached the trees. The last, the one near the shelter, pulled a knife and lunged, but Zane met him with the butt of his rifle and sent him crashing to the dirt. Silence fell. Zane turned toward the shelter, heart thudding. He pushed aside the flap and stepped inside. She was chained to a post, wrists raw, dress torn, hair matted to her face. But her eyes were clear, fierce, watching him like she was not sure if he was real. "Name's Zane Alder," he said, kneeling down. "Sheriff of Sweetwater, I came for you." She swallowed hard. "Are they all dead?" He nodded once. She let out a breath like she had been holding it for days, and her whole body sagged. He pulled a key from the belt of the man outside and undid her shackles. She flinched at first, but then let him lift her wrists gently, touch soft as dusk. "I am not going to hurt you," he said, voice low. "I know." Her voice was hoarse but steady. "I am Adaline Dorsey." He looked into her face, memorizing it in the firelight. "We should get you out of here." She nodded, but her legs gave out when she tried to stand. Zane caught her before she hit the ground. "You are safe now," he said. He wrapped her in his coat, lifted her into his arms, and carried her out into the night. By the time they made it back to Sweetwater, it was 3 days later and snow had started to fall. Adaline slept most of the ride, curled against him in the saddle, her head against his chest. She never asked him to let go. Zane took her to the back room of the town doctor's house. Doc and his wife, a kind woman named Ellen, helped clean her up and gave her something warm to eat. Zane waited outside while they worked, staring out at the street, jaw clenched tight. He had seen women hurt before. He had buried some, but something about Adaline clawed deep into him. Maybe it was the way she had looked at him in that tent, like she could not believe someone had finally come. Maybe it was the way she had not cried once, even after everything. Just held her chin up, bruises and all. That night when Ellen came out and said, "She is asking for you," Zane did not hesitate. Adaline sat on the edge of the cot, wrapped in a thick blanket. Her hair had been washed, her face clean, but her eyes were still stormy. "I just wanted to thank you," she said, voice soft. "You do not need to," he said, stepping inside. "I do, you found me, you killed them, you carried me out." Her hands twisted in the blanket. "I thought no one would come, I came," he said simply. Their eyes met. Something quiet passed between them, not loud or fast, just steady, like a river running deep. "Why?" she asked. "You did not even know me," Zane looked at her, jaw working. "Because no one deserves to be left like that." She nodded, eyes glassy. "You saved my life." "I did not just come to save your life," he said, voice low. "I came to bring you back to it." Her breath caught. She did not look away. Over the weeks that followed, Adaline stayed in Sweetwater. She took up work helping Ellen at the doctor's house, and slowly, the color returned to her face. She laughed sometimes. She started walking to the general store on her own. Folks in town came to know her name, and Zane, he found himself making excuses to see her. Stopping by with fresh bread, helping Ellen stack firewood, walking her home after sundown. He never pushed, never asked for more. but every time their eyes met, it was there. One afternoon, Adaline sat beside him on the porch of the sheriff's office, watching the sun dip low over the hills. Her hand brushed against his on the bench. She did not pull away. "I have not felt safe in a long time," she said. "You are safe now," he said. "With you, I believe that." He turned toward her, heart pounding. "Adaline." She leaned in slowly, her hand resting on his chest. "You freed me, Zane," she whispered. "Not just from them, from everything." He touched her face, thumb brushing her cheek. "You are the strongest person I have ever known." Then she kissed him. It was not rushed. It was not desperate. It was quiet and sure, like the beginning of something that had been waiting a long time to bloom. And when they pulled apart, both of them were smiling, not just because of what they had survived, but because of what they had found. The spring thaw came slow to Sweetwater, dragging its heels through April. Mud thickened under wagon wheels, and the last of the snow clung to the northern slopes like it didn't trust the sun. Adaline stood on the porch of the doctor's house, sleeves rolled to her elbows, hands damp with soap from scrubbing the porch rail. Pale scars marked her wrists now, thin and quiet, and though she wore no jewelry, her fingers moved like they remembered piano keys. Zane crossed the street with a quiet nod to the blacksmith, boots leaving prints in the soft earth. He carried a narrow wooden box, wrapped with twine, and stopped at the bottom of the steps. "I saw this in Casper when I went last week," he said, offering it up. Adaline wiped her hands on her apron and took it carefully. She untied the twine, lifted the lid. Inside lay a small set of watercolor pans, worn but still rich with color, and a folded bundle of stiff paper. She looked at him for a long moment. "How did you know I paint? You had that sketch tucked in your satchel," he said, his eyes steady. "The one of the desert hills. I figured you didn't draw something like that unless you missed it." Adaline touched the corner of the paper and let out a breath not sharp or broken, but surprised. "That was from Arizona Territory, before I ever saw a snowflake." He sat beside her on the steps, resting his forearms on his knees. "You ever think about going back?" "I did. For a long time." Her voice was quiet, without apology, "but there's nothing left for me there. My uncle sold the land after my brother died. I haven't heard from him since." Zane didn't speak right away. The wind stirred the hem of her apron and brushed the tips of the juniper beside the porch. "You don't have to explain," he said finally. "I just thought maybe it'd feel good, putting color on paper again." She nodded, eyes still on the box. "It does." Later that week, she brought a folded sheet to the sheriff's office and laid it on the desk without a word. It was a watercolor of the Sweetwater Hills at dawn, the pale light catching the curve of the stream, and a single rider outlined on the ridge. Zane recognized the way the shoulders sloped forward slightly in the saddle, the way the horse stood still, like it was listening. He didn't say anything, but he framed it and hung it behind his desk. That summer, Adaline began walking beyond the edge of town, carrying a canvas satchel and a small stool. She'd spend hours near the cottonwoods south of the creek, painting the way the wind moved through the grass, or the way the light dropped behind the hills. Sometimes, Zane would ride by on patrol and find her there, brush in hand, boots tucked under her skirt. "You always this quiet when you work?" he asked once, reining in beside her. "I used to hum," she said. "But now I just listen." He nodded, then dismounted, tying his horse to a fence post. He didn't ask to sit, but she shifted on the stool and motioned to the patch of grass beside her. They sat together in the hush of the afternoon, the only sound the creek chattering over stone. After a while, she said, "I don't look at people the same anymore, not after what happened." Zane didn't move. "How so?" "I used to think cruelty had a certain shape, a certain face, but it doesn't. It can sound polite, it can wear clean boots and say please and thank you." He looked at her hands, steady on the brush. "And kindness, that's quieter," she said, "but it stays longer." They stayed there until the light shifted. He watched her pack up, careful and deliberate, and when she stood, he offered his hand without needing to say anything. She took it, not out of weakness, but because it was offered with no expectation. By August, they had fallen into a rhythm. She came by the jailhouse most mornings with coffee in a tin cup, leaving it on the windowsill if he was out. He returned the favor in the evenings, bringing her peaches from the market or a book from the general store's dusty shelf. They spoke less in questions and more in shared glances, like they were building something that didn't need explaining. One evening, just after a summer storm had cleared the air, she found him sitting behind the office, whittling a strip of cedar. He handed her a thin carving of a swallow, wings outstretched. "I saw one dive over the creek last week," he said. "Made me think of you." She turned it over in her hands. "Why?" It looked like it had flown through worse and kept right on going. She smiled, the kind that reached her eyes. "You don't say much, do you?" "No," he said. "But I mean all of it." That night, as the lanterns flickered and the air cooled, she stepped close and rested her head against his shoulder. He didn't move, didn't speak, just let her stay there, the carved swallow tucked safe in her pocket. Neither of them said what it meant. They didn't need to. The meadow behind the livery stable bloomed thick with yellow wildflowers by mid-September. Zane stood with one hand on the post rail, watching as Adaline bent beside the creek, her skirt hitched to avoid the damp grass. She dipped a piece of linen into the water and wrung it out, then laid it flat on a broad stone to dry beside her brushes and tin palette. She glanced up. "You're not just passing by." "No," he said. "Deputy Jenkins is watching the office." "I thought I'd ask you something." She wiped her hands on her apron and stood. "Go ahead." He nodded toward the hill above the meadow. "There's a small house up there. Belonged to a cattle foreman who moved to Laramie. Nothing fancy, but it's got a porch that catches the morning light and a stove that draws better than mine." She waited, his meaning not yet clear. "I've been fixing it up," he said. "Windows needed new panes, floor needed sanding. It's almost ready." Her brow furrowed just slightly. "Why tell me? I don't want to live in it alone." She stepped closer, quiet as the breeze that stirred the grass between them. "Are you offering me a place to stay or something more than that?" He looked at her, steady and open. "I'm offering a life. If you want it." She didn't answer right away. Her gaze drifted to the stone with the drying linen, then back to him. "I didn't think I'd ever want to put down roots again," she said. "After what I lost, but you never asked me to forget. You just let me remember in peace. I don't need you to be anything but who you are," he said. Her eyes softened and she reached for his hand. "Then let's see it, the house." They walked the slope together, boots brushing through last year's prairie grass. The house stood near the top, tucked beside a row of wind-warped cottonwoods. The roof was patched with new shingles, and the porch posts had been sanded down smooth. Zane opened the door and stepped back to let her enter first. Inside, the floor gleamed faintly with linseed oil. A pot-bellied stove sat in the corner, its iron belly cold but clean. The windows looked east, and late afternoon light spilled across the boards in long golden slats. Adaline turned slowly, taking it in. "It smells like pine and beeswax." "I carved the swallow into the door frame," he said. "Same as the one I gave you." She crossed to the frame by the hearth and ran her fingers over the shallow carving. "You remembered the wing curve." "I remember everything about you." She turned to him then, eyes clear but full. "I don't want to just be given a place, Zane. I want to build it with you." He stepped forward. "Then let's build it together." They married under the cottonwoods 2 weeks later. It was quiet, no paper announcements. No organ hymns, just Ellen reading a verse and Deputy Jenkins clearing his throat when he got too choked up to finish the blessing. Adaline wore a calico dress the color of river clay, and Zane wore his cleanest shirt and the boots he'd resoled himself. They exchanged no vows beyond what their eyes already said. "I know what you've been through. I will not leave. I will not ask you to be anything but whole in your own time." That night they sat on the porch, the sky soft with stars. She leaned into his side, her head resting just below his shoulder. "Do you remember the first thing I said to you?" she asked. He nodded. "You asked if they were dead. I wasn't sure I'd ever feel anything again after that." She reached for his hand. "But I do. Every day with you, I feel more." He looked down at her fingers resting in his palm, then kissed her knuckles one by one, slow and sure. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of distant wood smoke and the last wildflowers. Behind them, their house glowed with lamplight, and beyond that, the town slept easy. Adaline let out a breath, not in fear or sorrow, but in contentment. Zane tightened his hold gently, not to claim, only to assure. They didn't speak again that night. They didn't need to. The silence between them held more than words, shared ground, earned trust, and a future neither of them had dared imagine when the world had been colder and darker. And now, with hearts unshackled and hands entwined, they faced the long road ahead. Not alone. Never again alone. By October, the mornings came edged with frost, and the cottonwoods behind the house turned the color of worn gold coins. Adaline stood barefoot in the kitchen, kneading dough for rye bread, the window cracked open to let in the scent of cold earth. The stove warmed the room in slow, steady breaths, and Zane's coat hung on the peg by the door, still dusted from his early ride to check the fences near the southern ridge. She paused when she heard the front door open, and a moment later he stepped into the kitchen, carrying a pair of leather gloves and a small wrapped parcel the size of his palm. "You were out longer than I thought," she said, brushing flour from her wrists. "Had to cut loose a steer that got tangled in a fence line," he said. "Found this out by the old trail marker tucked behind a stone." He handed her the parcel. The paper was creased and brittle, tied with a strip of pale blue ribbon. She untied it carefully, revealing a dried sprig of prairie sage and a folded note written in a woman's hand. The ink had faded around the edges. Zane leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "It's from someone named Ruthie Holt, signed it out of Fort Bridger. Says she left it for her sister, Adaline." Adaline stared at the note, her mouth parting slightly. "I haven't heard that name in 5 years. Ruthie was my cousin's daughter, half my age, sharp as flint. I didn't even know she was still alive." Zane didn't interrupt. "She left home before the war ended, ran off with a trapper. I thought she'd gone east." Her voice turned quiet. "She must have heard what happened, left this in case I ever pass through." "What does it say?" Adaline read the words silently, lips moving just once. Then she folded the paper again and pressed it flat beneath her hand on the table. "She said if I ever found my way free, I should plant the sage near my door, that it keeps bad dreams away." Zane stepped forward and touched her shoulder. "We'll plant it after supper." They did, just as the sky bruised into twilight. She chose a spot beneath the window near the porch, where the wind caught the corners of the house and the sun warmed the soil longest. Zane dug the hole with his pocket knife, and she pressed the dried sage into the earth with both hands. When she stood, she looked at him with something unreadable in her face. "She remembered me," she said. "After all that time, she must have known you'd survive." Adaline's gaze didn't waver. "I didn't for a long while." Zane didn't speak. He simply took her hand in his, and they stood there until the last of the light slipped behind the hills. In the days that followed, Adaline began rising before dawn, walking the edge of their land with a canvas satchel slung over one shoulder. She returned with pressed ferns, dry seed pods, and once a broken arrowhead she'd found buried near the creek. She began piecing them into her paintings, sealing them into the paper so they'd never slip free. One afternoon, she came into the sheriff's office with a rolled canvas bound in twine. Zane stood from his desk as she laid it flat. "It's for the schoolhouse," she said. "I promised Miss Danner I'd paint something for the children to look at besides arithmetic boards." He unrolled it slowly. The painting showed the Sweetwater Valley in spring wildflowers in bloom, birds overhead, and in the distance, a woman and man planting sage beside a small house. The figures were small, but the way they leaned toward one another made it impossible to miss. Zane ran his hand along the bottom edge. "They'll learn just fine under this." Adaline tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "I want them to know that even where it's quiet, even where it looks like nothing ever changes, people begin again." That night, after the lamps were out and the coals burned low, she reached for him beneath the quilt not out of fear or need, but because she could. Because the silence between them no longer held ghosts. "I think about what might have happened," she said softly. He turned toward her in the dark. "I don't," she let that settle. "You don't wonder about the ifs?" "No." He brushed his thumb across her wrist where the scar had faded to a pale line. "Only what's here, what's real." Her breath caught just once, then steadied. "I never thought I'd fall in love with someone who sees the world the way I do." "I didn't know I was waiting for you," he said. "But I was." She pressed her forehead to his, bare skin against bare skin, and in the hush that followed, there was no memory of chains or silence or blood in the dirt. Only warmth. Only what they'd built with their own hands, and outside, just beneath the porch window, the sage began to take root. The first snow came early that year, brushing the ridgelines with white even before the maples dropped their last leaves. Zane had just finished hitching the barn door against the wind when he noticed Adaline standing at the edge of the field, her shawl drawn tight around her shoulders. She wasn't looking at the weather. Her gaze was fixed on a wagon approaching from the east road, its wheels cutting quiet lines through the frost-hardened dirt. He crossed to her, wiping his hands on his trousers. Expecting someone, she shook her head once, slow. No. But I think I know who it is. The wagon rolled to a stop near the front gate. The driver was a woman in her middle years, bundled in a wool coat with a scarf tied beneath her chin. Her hair was a deep brown streaked with silver, and her eyes searched the yard until they landed on Adaline. She climbed down stiffly, her boots crunching over frozen grass. Adaline stepped forward, her voice caught somewhere between caution and wonder. "Ruthie," the woman let out a breath. "I thought I might be too late." Zane stayed a few steps behind, watching as Adaline reached out, not tentatively, but with something like disbelief. Ruthie took her hand, then pulled her close, arms wrapping around her with a kind of urgency born from too many years past. "I found your name in a ledger at Fort Bridger," Ruthie said, pulling back just enough to see her face. "You signed it for medicine. I came as soon as I saw it." "I didn't think anyone was looking," Adaline said. "I didn't stop," Ruthie replied. "I just didn't know where to look." They stood quiet for a while, heads bowed toward one another. The wind picked up, rattling the bare branches above them. Zane moved forward, laying a gentle hand on the small of Adaline's back. "This is Zane," she said, her voice steady. "My husband." Ruthie's gaze shifted to him. "You're the one who kept her standing." He met her eyes. She already knew how. Ruthie nodded once, then looked back at Adaline. "I have no place I need to be. If you'd have me for a spell, I'd be grateful." Adaline didn't hesitate. "You'll stay in the back room. It's warmest. You can help with the garden come spring." That evening, they ate by firelight. Ruthie shared stories of her years trading along the Green River and how she'd run a small post out near Evanston until the railroad shifted business west. She asked no questions Adaline didn't want to answer, and Adaline offered no pieces of the past she didn't choose to name. But Zane noticed the gentleness between them, the way their silences matched in rhythm. Later, after the lamplight had gone low and the house settled into quiet, Zane lay beside Adaline beneath the quilt they'd stitched together that summer. Her fingers traced lazy patterns along his forearm. "She's older than I remembered," she said softly. "But she's the same where it matters." He turned to face her. "You feel whole with her back," she nodded, eyes not quite meeting his. "I didn't realize I'd left part of myself behind with her, but yes." He brushed her hair back from her face. "You've given me pieces I didn't know I needed." She leaned into his chest, her voice a bare breath. "I love you." It wasn't the first time, but it was the first time spoken out loud. He kissed her temple, slow and certain. "I love you," he said. The days folded into winter with the kind of rhythm that came from work done side by side. Ruthie took to mending and sorting seed bundles, her hands quick despite the cold. Adaline painted in the early hours, before the frost melted, capturing the hush of snow on fence posts and the pale light stretching across the field. Zane took over the route between Sweetwater and the northern homesteads, riding out each week with supplies or letters, always back before nightfall. In February, Miss Danner came by with a parcel wrapped in burlap. Inside were letters from the schoolchildren, each page a jumble of misspelled thanks for the painting that hung above their chalkboard. One had drawn a crude version of Zane's old hat, labeling it Sheriff of the Valley. Another scribbled a row of wildflowers beneath a stick-figure house. Adaline laughed until her sides ached. When spring returned, they planted a second patch of sage beside the first, and Ruthie added a row of purple columbine along the fence. They didn't speak of the past much anymore, not because it was hidden, but because it had found its place in the story. Not the whole of it, just a chapter that pointed toward the rest. The house filled with warmth not just from the stove or the sun, but from the quiet way hands found each other in the evening, from the sound of Ruthie humming while she shelled peas, From the creak of the porch boards beneath Zane's boots when he came home each night and found Adaline waiting, always waiting, by the door. One late afternoon, she stood behind him as he repaired a loose hinge on the barn. He was focused, sleeves rolled, brow furrowed. She watched the way he moved, careful and firm. "You're still the man who carried me out of that canyon," she said. He looked over his shoulder. "You're still the woman who walked back into her own life." She smiled, then stepped close. "Let's never leave this place." He kissed her there in the doorway, the scent of cut hay and cedar thick around them. "We won't." Years later, when folks in Sweetwater spoke of Zane Alder and his wife, they remembered not the gunfights or the escaped gang, but the way the shutters on their house stayed painted, the way their porch light always burned through storm or snow, and how Adaline's paintings hung in every home from the schoolhouse to the mill. And behind their house, beneath the eastern window, the sage kept growing tall, full, and rooted deep.